Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining our session today. I'm Nicole Quain, Digital Marketing Manager at MCI USA. I'm excited to have with me today three Association Solution experts, Erin Fuller, Carrie Harden, and our moderator, Nikki Walker, who will be discussing replenishing, growing, and leveraging your reserves. Unfortunately, Sean Pierce was not able to join us today due to an unforeseen event. He's very sorry he cannot join us, but he knows that his colleagues can speak to the questions at hand. Before we get to it, I have a couple of quick housekeeping notes. We would love to see you. If you're comfortable, please turn on your camera. We want this presentation to be as interactive as possible. Throughout the presentation, we'll be using Zoom polls to get your insights. So you are encouraged to participate when you see those on your screen. We welcome your questions and your thoughts, so please feel free to use the chat throughout the presentation. And lastly, the session is being recorded, so we will be sending a link to the recording to all our registrants after the webinar. So with that, I am thrilled to pass it over to our moderator, Nikki Walker, Global Vice President of Engagement of Associations and Communities at MCI Group. Nikki, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Nicole, and hi, good afternoon to you all. I'm joining you from a very hot Dubai, although it's 8 o'clock in the evening, it's still up in the high 30s. But looking forward to our session here today. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Erin Fuller, who's the president of our Association Solutions Division here in the US, and Carrie Harden, who's president of our Sales Solutions and Services Division. And as Nicole said, we're going to share our thoughts a little bit around what's going on in the world today with associations reserves. And I really want to underline, the title. We talked about the business of associations, and managing reserves is very much a business strategy. So Erin, let me start with you. What have you seen going on, with association reserves as a result of the pandemic? Are you seeing any major changes, associations dipping into their reserves?
Sure. I think that, in general, one size does not fit all. We have some client partners that we work with that actually ended up the end of last year in a better situation than they forecasted at the beginning of 2020, which sounds kind of magical and incredible to many of us, I'm sure, on the call, but based on controlling expenses and making sure they really focused on delivering sponsor ROI and really good participant value, they were able to actually kind of come out ahead of the game. We have other organizations that clearly were, if not decimated, and we have seen some groups go out of business or at least become dormant as a result. And there's no question that there's a realization that cash is truly king or queen in this situation. And I think that, I know throughout this conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about how some organizations, I think, have been really entrepreneurial and very smart about how they've leveraged cash reserves if they've had them.
Right, absolutely. Carrie, what about on your side? Would you agree with what Erin has just said? Have you seen anything different?
I would agree with Erin. I have seen some organizations that actually ended the year better than expected, just because they were actually able to have a number of expenses they were able to save on, especially if their events were places that were not huge revenue generators for them. But with organizations where that event potentially had a net contribution of 50% or more, even as those organizations have made expense reductions, they typically have needed to tap into their reserves to get through the year. And I think the harder part then is to realize that the financial impact of this ultimately is lasting much longer than any of us thought in the first 3 months of the pandemic, and really needing to have a long-term strategy that allows their organization to still grow and find a way to thrive and use their cash management really carefully to weather the extended part of the pandemic here through this year. We've also seen several organizations that really have started to make some strategic investments and tried to find ways to make those as early as possible, particularly in places where they have good research that they can build and sell and drive that as a revenue generator for them, or places where there's an opportunity for data or certification. Most of those organizations, quite frankly, were already primed to make those moves even before the pandemic. And so the ones that had digital strategies already started that revolved around content, data, and information in many cases, they were able to accelerate those or make further investments to ensure that they could bring them to life quickly at the beginning of the pandemic and not, later here in 2021.
Yeah, I would agree, absolutely. Those that have a good digital strategy were in a better position. We've seen, particularly go back to what Erin was saying, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation right now, but those smaller associations that really depended on their single asset, their single product being, a conference or a congress or an annual meeting, they've definitely seen a dip in revenues, and some of them have had to dip into their reserves. So now let's ask all of you. Nicole, can you launch the first poll, please? Let's ask all of you what's happened in your organization. Have you had to dip into your reserves in the last 12 months? So you should see the poll on your screen now. So if you could kindly select one of those two answers and press submit. And as soon as Nicole's got a healthy number of responses, we will feed back the information to you.
Okay.
So what do we have, Nicole? Okay, so interesting, about 2/3 that haven't had to dip into the reserve. So congratulations, that's extremely good news. But still, 1/3 of you that have fortunately had the luxury of having reserves and being able to use them. So Erin, let me come back to you. We've always had best practices with regards to what we advise associations to keep in reserves in terms of having a healthy reserve portfolio and operating balance and budget. Have you seen changes? Have you found yourself recommending different strategies in these last 12 months?
Yeah, absolutely. ASAE's rule of thumb has always been 50% of your operating budget, right? So if you have a budget of $2 million, you should ideally have $1 million in reserve. And if I remember my CAE classes, they're about more than 20 years old now. It was the thinking there was it takes about 6 months to wind an association operations down. And so you wanted to have those reserves. So on the day you decided you're going to stop accepting dues, any other revenue in, you had the time to wind that group down. And so that thinking is really what's driven a lot of groups in terms of what they had on hand. And of course, we found out very quickly over the past year that if you had 6 months, you're going to come up about 9 months short at this point. And so that's really not going to be enough. Some groups were able to be incredibly nimble. And I think maybe the next question we could have asked, right, was if you didn't make cuts into your reserves, did you make expense cuts? In which I would assume 100% would say yes, right? So how deep, how bloody those cuts were, is something that each, I think, association is really trying to figure out. But some groups were able to make those cuts early on, make really strong and take decisive action and ride out the pandemic, really just using cash flow to manage the organization. Other groups, and I think, Nikki, to your point, where the business model rested on in-person events, found that obviously 50% of operating budget and reserves is just not going to be enough. I actually serve on the chair of a board of a trade organization where we're looking at a goal of 12 to 18 months now as kind of our new goal for reserve funding in light of what's happened with the pandemic, in light of the fact that our group traditionally has used in-person events for a lot of revenue growth. And I think that in general, assessing reserve goals for associations and nonprofits is now going to be a much more dynamic process based on the actual business model rather than a template or kind of a rule of thumb. And I know that internally within MCI, we're all starting to take an initial look of what is going to be that process. We usually partner with an investment firm and a team of advisors, but for the groups that we partner with, we're obviously the experts on their business model and results. And we're essentially going to need to do a portfolio analysis for each association based on their sources of revenue and determine how vulnerable each of those revenue sources are to internal and external factors. So as part of kind of the overall strategic and business planning, that environmental scan that's always a part of it, I think that's going to be increasingly important so that we can determine what that level is and how often the board needs to reassess that. I think that a lot of organizations have had investment policies that, you know, you'd have to kind of blow the dust off of to look at. You know, it's just been kind of, you know, on autopilot. And there's no question that all of the groups that we work with have all of a sudden realized that this is something that has to be much more actively managed.
And much more dynamic. Yeah. As you say, I mean, very often also associations can sit on very healthy reserves and they just sit there. You know, they get ignored. They're not necessarily used to invest back into the organization or, you know, to finance an initiative that can add member value. So have you seen any examples of really entrepreneurial, you know, almost more corporate, I used the word business at the beginning, you know, approach to how associations are thinking about their reserves?
Yeah, and you're right. It can be really frustrating to me. You know, I think we're taught too through probably the same study guides as the underlying principle for reserve goals, that, you know, any profit, any funding that's held year to year is really member equity, right? And so it's and so when we see groups that are holding something like 600-700% of their annual operating budget, to me that's, and then you look at a website that feels very clunky and out of date, or a brand that clearly needs to be refreshed, or content and a content strategy that's lacking. To me, that's a board doing a disservice to the members that have invested in the organization. And so I think that, you know, in terms of what we've seen, it's really been interesting. We worked with one organization, a global hybrid organization, trade and professional, last year, where they saw an organization in their space go bankrupt as a result of COVID. They're in the travel space, so not shockingly that was the impact. And that the larger global organization, although they were definitely impacted by COVID, they're a global travel organization, realized that there was a real opportunity to buy specific IP related to the group that went into bankruptcy. So they didn't want to absorb the full association. They didn't want to necessarily take on the branding, but the database, some of the content, the certification and credentialing programs, those are things that were really interesting. And so to that group. And so we worked with a bankruptcy trustee to kind of liberate those assets and bring them over into the larger organization. There's another client partner that we're working with where there's a small professional services firm, a for-profit group that for decades has had a very niche product that is directed towards really the membership of this association. The owner of the firm is looking for an exit strategy and would rather see that product line and those resources and his investment go to this nonprofit organization that has been such a source of business for him over the years. And so we're working on making a for-profit acquisition by a nonprofit, which I just think is fascinating. I just feel very lucky to be kind of part of that process. And I think that, and there's any number of kind of efficiencies there, but as I said earlier, you know, cash is king. And so organizations with cash, any cash, even if you're struggling compared to pre-COVID times, you're leveraging a buyer's market in terms of content, in terms of IP. And so I think this is a really remarkable time for associations to really determine how they want to best leverage any additional assets, because this is such an unusual time. I know, unprecedented time. We're all sick of hearing that. But in terms of the business model, there are real opportunities for organizations that can act quickly. And we know that that's a whole other webinar, right, in terms of timing of decision making. But for boards that really have a business orientation and can have conversations where they take the emotion or the ownership or the tradition out of it, I think have been able to really leverage opportunities presented during the past year, and we're seeing them come out. The groups that are so wrapped up in mourning the loss of what they weren't able to do, I think can get stuck there, and as a result may miss or ignore or not be able to respond in a timely fashion to opportunities as presented. So this is a great example of where culture really can drive overall business strategy.
Yeah, I like the expression mourning the loss. Can you hear me? Because I gather my sound wasn't so good.
Much better.
So let's go, Nicole, let's go back to our poll, our second poll, and ask our guests today whether they expect to we actually worded the question to have to utilize your reserves in the next 12 months, but it's also an interesting question of whether you think you should use your reserves. But the question is, do you expect to have to use your reserves in the next 12 months? So again, if you could give us your yes or no vote on that, and press submit, and Nicole will let us know what the majority situation is. And then Kerry, I'm going to come back to you after we get these results.
Sounds perfect. I love some of Erin's creative examples that she showed of what organizations are doing to find new assets to bring into their organization, or how to leverage capital in a meaningful way.
Yeah, it's okay. So again, that's interesting, you know. So as I said, the question was, do you expect to have to? So that was, you know, more of a needs must. So yeah, 73% of you are not having to dip into your reserves. So that's great. But I think a lot of what our conversation today is about, you know, is what do you do to leverage your reserves? And, you know, you just mentioned capital opportunities. You know, these are kind of words that don't necessarily sit around association board discussions. So Kerry, you know, what have you been talking to your clients about, and how do you think associations can go out and actually think about, you know, maybe bringing in capital from outside?
Yeah. Certainly for many organizations, it's just a different way of thinking, right? How do we find capital that allows us to grow in the way that we want to in the future? You know, for a long time, there have been models that have been out there where associations have been able to have, you know, investment management partnerships for large events where somebody else would end up owning 50% or more of that event. And they ultimately lose control of the asset, but they're able to get a significant amount of capital brought back into the organization. And as we've been talking to associations and clients, there are definitely places where they need and want to find capital to bring into their organization, but they don't want to lose control of, in some cases, one of their most valuable assets, which might be their trade show or event. And so one of the places where MCI has been working to really try to help connect people to what a good next step could be is looking at a different type of business model for raising that equity. And so in equity investment partnership, where associations, instead of losing control 50% or more of their event, could actually just have somebody come in and take a minority stake, 20% or so, right? But that would allow them to then have the cash that would allow them to reinvest. So many organizations, especially ones with large trade shows, have needed to let, unfortunately, a lot of staff go. If you look at, you know, 2-year run of not having what could be your largest revenue producer, it's been hard to keep the needed infrastructure in place. And then to bring it back quickly and in a profitable, robust way, it takes investment to make that happen, and to be able to get that done. There are deposits and other expenses and staff that need to come along with it. And so, Nikki, this model is a little bit different. You know, it's one that would leverage private equity investment, allow a private equity group to have a minority stake within that association's event, allow the association to have the investment capital that's brought in to help their organization. And then one that essentially allows for that private equity investment to be there for about 5 years, right? With a goal of growing and getting that event back into the type of growth model that it probably was prior to the pandemic, right? Especially in those really strong markets. And so, you know, I think there's a great opportunity for organizations who are saying, we've got to find some sources of capital here, but we don't and won't lose our most important product that we have and the way it produces revenue for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, our role at MCI is very much as a mediator, you know, between those that have an interest in investing and the association community. And we're very much working, you know, with impact investors, those that are not necessarily looking for, you know, what a corporate or a startup or a high tech, you know, high return, fast return on capital investment, but rather looking for how they can help impact society. And associations are a great channel for that. So I think you're right. It is the opportunity now also for, for our associations and all of you listening to really be quite bold in terms of thinking, how can you leverage some of your assets, but as you so rightly said, Barry and Erin before you, without losing the ownership or the control, but this minority investment, and it allows then the association, to have additional capital to invest in new products and programs. So I think we're very aligned in, the importance of connecting, the investment community with our association community. So Erin, anything else that you've experienced in that regard in terms of kind of this approach to investment? And you also talked about mergers and acquisitions earlier on.
I think, I think just in general, kind of going back to that board decision-making process, we're really asking, it's like signing your name with your non-dominant hand, right? So we're asking people to lean in and be much more thoughtful or conscious of what they're doing. And that applies to every single thing an association has done, right? We used to go to the big meeting and, we would have all of our connection and we'd launch all of our products and new content, et cetera, all, within a week, which was fatiguing for staff, right? And now we're trying to reverse that out and making sure we're kind of doling it out regularly to keep people engaged. I think that, so for, Nikki, to your point, we've warned groups for years that the membership or customer value proposition can't be weak content and regular engagement resting on that national event. And so they have to invest, a lot of groups are needing to invest all they have in strengthening the value proposition. And I think to Carrie's point, what's interesting and so the same thing kind of applies to the business management, right? The only source of capital an organization has is cash flow and what they have in reserves. Those are the two things that associations have. And then within that approach to reserves, it's how aggressive are we going to be? And most associations are incredibly conservative in how they invest their reserves. I think that, Carrie and I were talking through this yesterday. It's very similar. We know tons of people that when it comes time to put a kid through college, they go ahead, they leverage their main asset, which is a house in the US, and they leverage it with a HELOC or with a second mortgage to give them additional cash flow to pay for that, knowing that their debt may be extended or the payment terms may need to change. And I think, Carrie, the example you just gave of having associations look at assets, whether it's their content or other IP or events, and leveraging that in a way where now, instead of just reserves, and some of that money may be less or more liquid than others, there's other investment opportunities. I think it'll be really exciting to see what associations take advantage of that.
It was interesting, Erin. Last week, I was talking to a mergers and acquisitions broker who has actually a lot of items that are sitting there that relate to content and data, all within that M&A space. And it's either an opportunity for an association to buy access to content that would be very expensive for them to start to build and curate on their own, or even then conversely, be able to take an asset that they have and potentially sell it because maybe it's no longer relevant to the future value that they're going to bring to their industry and profession.
Yeah, and Carrie, that's something we often talk about is the product life cycle. It's looking at, and this pandemic has been a great opportunity to do that and kind of really work out, which of your products or services or programs are generating the most revenues and which are some of those that, probably ought to be sunset. And I know you've had many conversations with associations with that regard. Any gems that you'd like to share with the audience?
There are a few things in there. We've seen a few organizations that have said, we own, depending on where you're located, especially if you're not maybe in an area like DC, they say we own our building. And it's been, historically a really good place for us to have investment. But if we're looking at a workforce that's no longer going to be physically in the office as frequently as they have been in the past, or if our headcount is less because maybe we found ways to be more efficient, it's been an asset that they've said, this might be time for us to sell and use our money in a different way. And so we've seen people making, what I would consider to be more traditional decisions around those pieces, but really they've looked ahead to the future and they've said, what does our workforce look like? Is everybody going to be sitting in the same place? Are we going to leverage talent that's going to come from anywhere as part of our organization? And do we need a large building then to be able to have a home to make all of that happen? The other thing that we've seen people doing is really looking at their content and education programs to ensure that they've got the right educational and certification programs moving forward. And again, I think touching on a little bit of what Erin had noted earlier, it is the look ahead as part of that strategic vision of the organization to say, who are we? What is the unique value that we bring back to the marketplace? How do we make sure we've got the right content, assets, education, community to be able to fill those needs? And the things that no longer align in those are potentially places where organizations need to make those changes. And sometimes then those are opportunities to actually sell products to others that might have need or interest. We've seen a lot of organizations who had been starting to work in a very kind of broad approach come back to a bit of their center and say, this is who we are and this is what we represent. And the things that sit outside of this are no longer our core audience. They're not ones that have made us money. There are other organizations sometimes that fill those needs. And we've got to stay centered on, what we're doing and where we're taking our industry.
And Carrie, that reminds me of, the other piece I would say, kind of similar to the building, right? And we've worked with a lot of groups where that real estate and talking about mourning the loss of something, that's a really big thing for a lot of groups where there's so much pride to see that building and their logo on it, and all of the physical elements that are named after donors or past leaders. There's a lot there to kind of unpack. There's a whole other different aspect, but similar in terms of shedding maybe some baggage that doesn't work in the model anymore. We're working with a number of groups now that is really looking at their core value proposition, right? So is the core value proposition to be a building owner or a landlord? Probably not. Is the core value proposition for them to be managing a variety of components, which may not be central to the overall mission and value proposition to the core members? And so we've seen a lot of organizations in different spaces look at things like regional or local chapters, looking at special interest groups and other kind of elements or components of associations, and decide, actually, these components have now grown into something that has such an entity. And sometimes there may be kind of conflicts in terms of policy objectives or overlapping program and content. And so we've worked with some organizations to help some of those components become their own entity and work to become a new organization. And so I think that it's the same kind of reflection and evaluation of the business model, but very different results.
Yeah, so let me just take us back to our audience. I see we've got a question in the chat, so maybe we can look at that. How do you make the case to your association being entrepreneurial doesn't run counter to the ethos of being a non-profit organization?
I think
Erin, you take that one.
Well, I think we always say that nonprofit is as a tax status, not a business objective, right? So we have to remind that the boards of directors that they are the boards of directors of a corporation which has a protected tax status that they'll reinvest results into member equity, what I said to you earlier. And so, profitability doesn't mean that anyone's lining their pockets, right? Profitability means you're able to offer more, and maybe even offer more at a lower price point or reduced access point to students or emerging professionals. So there's a benefit there. But there's no question that, again, the culture of the organization, explaining kind of some of the business opportunities. If you are a K through 12 teacher, you're much more comfortable talking about things like content and engagement in person, right? Because that's kind of the business model of where you work. When we speak to people who are attorneys that run large firms, they're much more comfortable in speaking about a reserve and investment strategy. And so we have to meet people where they are, and we have to think of the examples we can leverage to show that kind of decision making is important. And I think, again, our job when we work with our client partners is to push people out of their comfort zone, right? When you have a group of accountants that isn't comfortable doing a strategic plan because that kind of nebulous thinking and ideation isn't kind of their native language, it's our job to push there. Just like it's the same job when we're working with folks that have really incredible soft skills and EQ to make sure that they're also focused on the business management of the organization.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's one piece I keep in mind a lot, Nikki, when I think about the question that was raised, which is it is not an or question. It really is, how can you do both? It is an and question. And I think that if you can work with your board and get them to understand the and mindset versus the or mindset, it really helps them. And I have to think that for many organizations who have needed to find ways to weather the last 12 months and the 12 months that are ahead of us, they will continue to understand really the value of making sure that they are generating enough revenue, because that's what's allowed them to get through a pandemic. And so that question is going to be more important than ever. But I think remembering it's an and not an or.
Very good point, Kerry, and your whole point about growing revenue. So I want to go back to the audience right now. Nicole, can you launch the third poll, please, where we're asking our participants if you see a growth in revenues in the next 12 months compared to the last 12 months. There's a choice of 4 answers there: negative growth, zero growth, up to 20%, or more than 20%. So where is your organization in this revenue generating complexity, if you like, at the moment? And then Kerry, once we've got the results, let's come back to you, because revenue strategy, and we were talking about reserve strategy. And I think the overall important thing that we're saying here is whether it's revenue generation, or whether it's an investment strategy, or whether it's managing your reserves and utilizing your reserves, you have to have a deliberate strategy in order to know what you're going to do. And a year ago, kind of our world of strategy kind of got turned upside down, and there was mass panic around how do we reinvent the whole association model, with moving from face-to-face into virtual, and some are daring to go hybrid, and some are even bringing back some small face-to-face meetings. So Nicole, have we got the response?
Sure do.
Okay, so oops, it's gone before I could see it. But I thought, yeah, okay, so this is quite positive that, okay, we're talking relative to last year. So last year wasn't necessarily, or the last 12 months wasn't necessarily the most financially promising period for a lot of associations. But interesting that over 60% are seeing a growth compared to last year of up to 20%. So that's very encouraging. So Kerry, let me come back to you. On revenue growth strategy, we've talked about product life cycle. We've talked about having the right products in the right place. We've talked about transforming, reinventing, and not being afraid to sunset. What else are you finding associations are doing, particularly now, to generate more revenues?
Yeah, I think there are a handful of things, Nikki. One, we've seen organizations and have been working with many of our clients, especially here in the first quarter of 2021, to pick their heads up out of 2020, right? To stop doing the place where you feel like you're just chasing the next decision that has to come tomorrow, and trying to get to the end of the year. And it is a mindset shift to really start to go, wait, we need to be living towards a strategic plan and the goals that we've set for our organization. And in that, I think there's a huge opportunity to pick your head up and really start looking at the long-term opportunities that come around revenue. Digital is going to be a permanent part of the way we generate revenue, and the permanent part of the way that we engage. And so I think there's massive opportunity there. And it gets really hard for organizations then when they want to start to understand, okay, what does that really mean for me when we think about digital? And so, thinking about, again, assets such as education and training, learning and development, certification, content, community building, community expansion are all part of what need to come through that digital ecosystem. And then continuing to, I think, really invest in strong relationships within the supplier community that helps those association professionals do their best. We have seen organizations really live into that kind of 20% type of forecasted growth for this next year in the places where they've been able to stay very, very close to their suppliers. And in some cases, create new partnership models that have meaningful revenue shares back for both the association and driving marketing engagement for the suppliers. It's a great opportunity to rethink all of those pieces. The two things I continue to remind clients of: now is a great time to test and learn, right? Try new things, figure it out. If it doesn't work, change it, and change it quickly. All with the mindset then of saying, by the time we get to the start of Q3, there needs to be a strong documented revenue strategy in place for 2022 so that you're building the momentum of people and resources into that. So lots of experimentation now to build revenue, and then make sure that the revenue that you're producing is having bottom line impact. And that can be in small ways or in large ways, but you've got to make sure that everybody's working with a mentality of anything we do has to produce net revenue that can help to fund and drive our operations.
Yeah, the net revenue is the important point that you've made. And you know, we see sometimes some sort of pitiful accounting going on in associations where really they're not sure which products and programs are driving those net revenues. So I want to just ask, you know, participants, we saw an optimistic, you know, up to 20% growth forecast from many of you out there. Is there anybody that would like to share, you know, why you feel that optimism, or has a question for us? Because we only have a few minutes left, but we'd love to hear from any of you that want to share, what is it that's driving the optimism for you? So if you want to share that with us, please unmute yourself. We'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, I will take us to the chat, but I'd like to give anybody an opportunity that would care to share.
I think, Nikki, as you wait to see if we have any willing volunteer, Carrie, to your point, you know, all of us at the beginning of last year, we were paralyzed, right? I mean, literally stuck in one place. We didn't know, you know, if we could go anywhere for a holiday or even to the grocery store, right? Every single decision was fraught with so much peril, and it made it really, really challenging. And then, so that's just in your home every day. And then the same thing for work. And then if you're a volunteer leading an organization. So I do think that, you know, the ability now for us to have, I think, a much longer sightline, you know, as we see people get vaccinated, and we're seeing people more out and about, and we can now envision a future where people are going to be more comfortable. I think that we're also going to see folks embrace more of a strategic and design considerations. I think it's really aligned with what you just said.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think anybody's raised their hand or unmuted themselves unless I'm wrong. Nicole, did you see anything? But I do have a question in the chat. So question, Kerry, maybe you want to answer this. Do you see the pandemic as having created any permanent changes when it comes to association reserves?
Yeah, I do think there are some permanent changes. And even in echoing back to some of what Erin covered earlier in this session, right, where the standard of what a reserve needs to be and how far it needs to get you just has to be different. I think the concept of a rainy day, knowing that a rainy day could be a rainy few years that could completely knock out your largest source of revenue, ultimately needs to be thought of differently. What I think is going to be interesting is to see how quickly organizations who have needed to tap into their reserves are able to rebuild them. I think the other thing that will kind of permanently change are organizations that have had assets that potentially create a significant amount of revenue in year one, and that revenue is then designed to fund 2 or 3 years of operating expense, and sometimes in the large trade show market that has been the case. And I think those models will just no longer exist. It's too much risk for boards to take that and accept that as the norm and move it forward. And in some cases, I think those are the places where somebody has needed to, you know, create immense reserves in 1 year to fund 3 years of operating costs around a single event. I think those are places where people will ultimately need a cash infusion that can come from, you know, an equity market in some way to get them through to their next viable building and strategic step.
And Kerry, just by way of sort of closing comments, you talked about, you know, innovation being really important right now. Now is the time to, you know, innovate, experiment in time for 2022. And I think that's, you know, just a sort of remark I would like to share as we close up is that associations very often don't think of their reserves as a possibility to invest in innovation. So, you know, they're always thinking, oh, we have to, you know, sort of kind of subsidize our innovation from operating budgets. But as long as the innovation or the experiment is, you know, clearly articulated, you've got a product plan, you know what you're trying to do, deciding to invest some of your reserves, into your own organization and the growth of your organization and the growth of member value, as long as you've got a kind of charted expectation, and this comes back to understanding what products generate and what programs generate, as long as you have an expectation of ROI, it's a great way to use reserves, support innovation, invest, and then monitor and look back and say, okay, what did that investment bring us? And did that investment bring more to the association by saying, taking, I don't know, 100K from reserves and putting it into our own organization than that 100K sitting on a volatile stock market, for example, might have done. So unless, Erin, let me come back to you for your closing comments.
Yeah, I think in general, I'm just really optimistic. After a year of feeling very reactive and working with groups where there were just so many decisions to make in such a short amount of time without any type of guidance or historical reference, it's just been incredibly challenging, and people were really fatigued. I was fatigued during that time. I think that already the conversations we're having at the end of Q1 2021 are just very different than the conversations we were having even 3 or 4 months ago. And I do think that, when you come out on the other side of something and you realize that, like any negative experience, there are always things that make people and organizations stronger and more resilient. And I think that there are a lot of boards who are really taking rightful pride in that and their ability to weather something that's really been truly all-consuming. I think that they're ready to have those conversations and understand that the excuses given that why we couldn't do things differently are all kind of on the table. And I think that that includes the value proposition for members, especially as we've now seen kind of that value proposition flatten out, right? I always say we have a whole generation right now that's managed to get rid of cable and cobble together an entertainment experience. They'll do the same thing with a membership experience, right? If they can cobble together a LinkedIn and some Google searching and some other things, these associations realize they've got to really lean in strong to really make a very special and customized experience for their community. But I think that they're really ready to have those conversations. And of course, within MCI, those are exactly the kind of strategic, design-focused conversations that we are really excited to have. After cash flow management for a year, I think we're all ready for a little strategy, a lot of innovation and new product development.
Yeah, absolutely. Innovation, optimism, opportunities. We saw the optimism coming from our participants with that last poll. So with that, thank you, all of you, for joining us this afternoon. It's been a pleasure having you, and we haven't had any more questions, so we're going to wrap up for the day. And as Nicole has just shared, please do visit our website. And I believe, Nicole, we will be sending out the recording to everybody that's participated. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so have a very good afternoon, all of you, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar.
Excellent.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.